Here's a project that was supposed to open 6 years ago. Here's a project that has consumed over $18 billion. And here's what California has to show for it. Concrete pillars, no operational track, no trains, no passengers. This is the California High-Speed Rail Project, a railway voters approved back in 2008 with a promise that sounded almost futuristic at the time. 220-mile-per-hour trains connecting San Francisco and Los Angeles. The original price tag? $33 billion. The current worst-case estimate? $231 billion. So how does something like this happen? How does the richest state in the richest country on Earth approve one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in modern American history, and end up with unfinished concrete in the middle of farmland nearly 2 decades later? Because the deeper I looked into this project, the less it felt like a California story, and the more it felt like a warning about America itself. A warning about what happens when a system becomes so complicated, so politically fragmented, and so afraid of admitting failure that it loses the ability to build. And the answer, it turns out, involves disappearing public records, billions in overruns, and eventually a devastating conclusion from the one man whose job was to independently oversee the project from the inside. A man who spent 15 years trying to warn California that the railroad was heading toward what he eventually called a dead end. To understand how California got here, we have to go back to 2008, when the project still looked like the future. November 4th, 2008. The same night America elected Barack Obama president, California voters approved Proposition 1A, the Safe, Reliable, High-Speed Passenger Train Bond Act. It passed with 52.7% of the vote, and the pitch was almost irresistible. $9 billion in bonds, a total project cost of $33 billion, trains hitting 220 miles per hour, San Francisco to Los Angeles in 2 hours and 40 minutes, and it would all be done and running, by 2020. California voters looked at Japan's Shinkansen, a rail system that has been running at over 150 miles per hour since 1964, and thought, we can do that. We can be world-class. We can build something that lasts a century. And in fairness, the dream wasn't crazy. The LA to San Francisco corridor is one of the most heavily travelled routes in America. Millions of people make that trip every year by plane, by car, through endless freeway frustration and airport misery. A fast train would genuinely transform that. The economics, if everything worked perfectly, could work. But here's what the voters weren't told. Or more accurately, here's what was buried in the fine print. The $33 billion number assumed everything went right. Federal matching funds would materialize, private investment would flood in, construction would proceed in California at costs comparable to China or Spain. And the 2-hour 40-minute promise, that was a legal requirement written into Proposition 1A itself, non-stop, no compromises, 2 hours and 40 minutes. As early as 2012, independent analysts at UC Berkeley were already warning that projected travel times were likely to be closer to 4 hours once the route was fully modelled. Not 240, 4 hours. And independent cost reviewers were noting the $33 billion estimate was what they diplomatically called not reliable. The California High-Speed Rail Authority, the body created to build this thing, had been warned, early, loudly. They continued anyway. Here's where it gets really interesting, because construction actually did begin. In January 2015, Governor Jerry Brown held a ceremonial groundbreaking in Fresno. Shovels went into the dirt, a band played, people cheered, and the California High-Speed Rail Authority began building a 171-mile stretch of track through the Central Valley between the cities of Merced and Bakersfield. Not San Francisco to Los Angeles, Merced to Bakersfield. Planners argued this made perfect sense. The Central Valley was flatter, cheaper, and easier to build through than California's mountains or dense coastal cities. Start there first, prove the concept, attract more investment, then extend the line north and south later. At least, that was the idea. By mid-2026, crews had completed major segments of concrete guideways and viaducts spanning roughly 60 to 80 miles. Real, visible progress on the ground, even if still far from a functional rail line. But what the engineers weren't telling you was this. A Central Valley segment is essentially useless, without the expensive mountain tunnels and coastal corridors at both ends. You can't sell a train ticket from San Francisco to Los Angeles on a line that runs through Fresno. The build-in-the-middle first strategy was, critics argued, a way to start spending money and force future politicians' hands, what economists call sunk cost politics. Once you've built the middle, you have to keep going, right? It was a massive gamble. Construction began before large portions of the land had actually been secured. That triggered years of eminent domain battles with farmers, property owners, and local communities across the Central Valley. At the same time, engineers discovered another expensive problem hiding underground: utilities. Thousands of gas lines, water pipes, electrical systems, and fiber optic cables had to be relocated before construction could continue. In some cases, records were outdated or incomplete. Costs climbed rapidly. This is where the project stopped looking like a transportation plan and started looking like a systems failure. No single institution fully controlled the process. Local governments fought root decisions. Environmental lawsuits delayed timelines. Consultants benefited from keeping contracts alive. Politicians wanted visible construction progress. And once billions had already been committed, almost nobody had an incentive to stop. The deeper California got into the project, the harder it became politically to admit the original assumptions might never work. And then the numbers started changing. By 2018, estimated costs had climbed past $70 billion. By 2022, projections approached $100 billion. Then, in February 2026, the California High-Speed Rail Authority released its draft 2026 business plan. The headline estimate for Phase 1, San Francisco to Los Angeles, was now $126 billion. But buried deeper in the report was another figure, a high-end, unoptimized scenario. $231 billion. 7 times the original promise, and after nearly 2 decades of work, the system still remained entirely non-operational. Now, to be fair, the agency disputes the $231 billion number. They argue it represents a worst-case planning scenario rather than the expected final cost. But critics noticed a pattern. At almost every stage of the project, the numbers once dismissed as alarmist eventually started looking realistic. And around this same time, something else began disappearing. In 2019, thousands of pages of historical records vanished from the agency's website. Board materials, change orders, historical planning documents, financial records. Researchers and journalists trying to track the project's evolution suddenly found major gaps. Management later said some materials had been archived or reorganized, but critics argued the changes made oversight dramatically more difficult. Obtaining older records increasingly required formal California Public Records Act requests, a slow and frustrating process. Then the California State Auditor released a devastating report. Its title said almost everything. Flawed decision-making and poor contract management have contributed to billions in cost overruns and delays. The audit described weak oversight, questionable contracting practices, and major management failures inside the project. And by early 2026, scrutiny had reached its highest levels. Investigators launched an inquiry involving the project's CEO after questions emerged surrounding a possible conflict of interest tied to KPMG, a consulting firm holding a major advisory contract with the project. The railroad was no longer just becoming expensive, it was becoming politically radioactive. By 2026, even the federal government had started pulling away. Congress permanently rescinded nearly $1 billion in federal grants tied to the project. Before that, federal officials had already withdrawn another $4.2 billion in funding, citing multiple failures by the authority, including unresolved financing gaps and missed project obligations. One detail became especially embarrassing. California had still not finalized train procurement. After nearly 2 decades, California was building pieces of a high-speed rail system without even selecting the trains themselves. The Federal Railroad Administration eventually summarized the situation with a remarkably blunt line. The mere promise of delivering the system someday, and at some cost, was not the bargain struck. And yet, despite all of this, the delays, the lawsuits, the exploding costs, the disappearing records, the collapsing federal support, many people still believed the project itself was worth saving. Now, I want to be fair here, because there is a genuine argument for building this railroad, and honestly, it's not a weak argument. California is now the fourth largest economy in the world by some measures. The corridor between San Francisco and Los Angeles is one of the most economically productive regions on the planet. Tens of millions of trips happen between Northern and Southern California every year by car and by air. And anyone who has sat in Bay Area traffic, crawled through the grapevine, or spent 2 hours inside LAX security understands the appeal immediately. A successful high-speed rail line would fundamentally reshape the state. Japan proved that decades ago. The Tokaido Shinkansen between Tokyo and Osaka has been operating since 1964. It transformed business travel, regional development, and commuting patterns across Japan. France's TGV network reshaped intercity transportation across Europe. In countries that successfully built high-speed rail, the long-term economic effects were real. And California had advantages most countries would envy: massive population centers, enormous wealth, geographic demand, and overwhelming public support. In other words, the core idea was never absurd, which makes the comparison to China so uncomfortable. Over roughly the same period California spent struggling to build a single operational segment, China built tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail infrastructure. On the other hand, China can do things democratic governments cannot. Land acquisition is faster. Environmental review is limited. Political opposition can simply be overridden. California is not China, and most Americans would not want it to be. But the contrast still forces an uncomfortable question. If modern America cannot build major infrastructure projects efficiently anymore, not nuclear plants, not subways, not rail, not transmission lines, then maybe California high-speed rail is not an isolated failure. Maybe it's a warning about the system itself, and that's what makes this story genuinely sad. Because beneath all the lawsuits, audits, overruns, and political fights, there really was a version of this project that could have transformed California. A faster connection between Northern and Southern California, economic integration for the Central Valley, less dependence on short-haul flights and endless freeway expansion, a piece of infrastructure designed to last a century. The tragedy isn't that people dream too big. The tragedy is that the system proved incapable of delivering the dream. And then someone from inside the system finally said it out loud. Lou Thompson was not an outside critic. He was not a partisan activist. And he was not opposed to high-speed rail. Thompson helped found Amtrak in the early 1970s. He later advised railway development projects for the World Bank. And from 2009 to 2024, he served on California's own high-speed rail peer review group, the independent oversight body created specifically to evaluate the project honestly. For 15 years, he watched the project from the inside, and for years Thompson warned California lawmakers that the railroad's financial assumptions, timelines, and planning structure were becoming increasingly detached from reality. The warnings changed nothing. Then, in 2024, Thompson resigned from the oversight group and called for an independent investigation into what had gone wrong. They never launched one. And then came the letter. On March 27, 2026, Thompson wrote directly to California's legislative leadership, no longer as an official reviewer, but as a private citizen with 15 years of front-row access to the project. His conclusion was devastating. In my judgment, he wrote, the draft 2026 business plan describes a project that has reached a dead end. Not delayed, not struggling, not over budget. A dead end. Thompson wrote that megaprojects are often doomed early by unrealistic estimates, political optimism, weak accountability, and institutional incentives that reward continuation even when failure becomes obvious. And then he described exactly what he believed had happened in California. People with no personal consequences for being wrong, and other people with strong incentives to keep the project alive no matter how unrealistic it became. According to Thompson, no one in legislative leadership ever responded to his letter. Think about that for a moment. The man tasked with independently reviewing California's largest infrastructure project spent 15 years warning the state it was drifting toward failure, and when he finally concluded the project had reached a dead end, Sacramento largely moved on as if he hadn't said it at all. That, more than the overruns or delays, may be the most revealing part of this entire story. So where does the project go from here? Option 1. California cancels the project entirely. A growing number of lawmakers now openly support this approach. Republican State Senator Tony Strickland said publicly, "This is a project that will never be built, and everybody in this building knows this project will never be built." Cancellation would stop the bleeding, but it would also mean writing off $18 billion with essentially nothing to show for it beyond some unfinished overpasses that will cost money to remove. And the Central Valley communities that were promised economic transformation, they get monuments to a broken promise. Option 2. California scales back dramatically. Instead of a true San Francisco to Los Angeles high-speed system, the project could become what it increasingly resembles already, a Central Valley regional rail line. Critics note this approach almost certainly violates Proposition 1A, which legally mandated a fully dedicated high-speed line capable of connecting the two mega-regions in under 3 hours. In other words, Option 2 is legally questionable. Option 3. California somehow finds a miracle. Private investors emerge, a new federal administration provides funding, costs somehow stabilize. The full vision gets built by the 2038 date now being floated for just the first operational segment. I'm not going to pretend that outcome looks especially likely right now. The Federal Railroad Administration cited multiple failures when it withdrew billions in funding. Independent analysts continue warning about major financing gaps. And the project's own oversight leadership now describes the current trajectory as a dead end. But honestly, the part of this story that bothers me most is not the money. It's the human cost. There are roughly 10 million people in the Central Valley. Many of them are agricultural workers living in communities with limited economic opportunity. They were told this railroad would bring jobs, investment, stations, and connection to the coastal economies that have left them behind. Some of those communities negotiated, compromised, allowed their neighborhoods to be disrupted in anticipation of a train that may never come. That's the cost nobody puts in the business plan. I've spent a lot of time with this story, and I keep coming back to one thing Lou Thompson wrote in his letter. He said, megaprojects tend to be driven by people with no skin in the game. No personal consequence if they're wrong. The consultants get paid either way, the officials move on to other roles, the contractors file their change orders, and the taxpayers, the people who voted yes in 2008 because they believed in something, they're left looking at concrete pillars in a field. That $18 billion and counting could have gone toward widening Central Valley highways, building desperately needed housing, or upgrading conventional rail lines that could have delivered real benefits years ago. I don't think California's high-speed rail was purely a scam. I think it was something sadder than that. A genuinely good idea, captured early by institutional inertia, driven forward by sunk costs and political pride, and protected from honest reckoning by the people who had the most to lose from one. The technology to build fast trains has been with us for 60 years. That was never really the question. The harder thing, the thing that remains unbuilt, is the institutional honesty to call a project what it is when it's failing, and the political character to do so before the money's gone and the concrete is already in the ground. Maybe that's what California high-speed rail will ultimately teach us. Not how to build a train, but how much a good story, badly managed, ends up costing. If you want to understand how this kind of infrastructure failure happens on a global scale, and which megaprojects are at risk right now, Design Zip is where we dig into exactly that. The subscribe button is there if you want to come along.